How lucky are we that we're on this planet that's protected by a moon that's the perfect distance from the sun? Like, holy shit,
But
this is fragile.
But what's interesting about both of those issues, COVID and climate change, is that what people will say is that in a time of crisis, we can't afford the luxury of dissent.
Or we can't afford you, but you don't even understand it. That was my point. Is like these people that will argue like violently that you should adhere to climate. When you start asking them questions like, what percentage of carbon is in the atmosphere? Yeah. Like, what is the consequences of it raising or lowering? What's the negative consequences of it lowering?
But they can't answer that.
They don't know.
And the thing is that, my retort to those people on both of those issues, COVID and climate change, is that it's precisely in a time of crisis or a challenge to society or some problem, external problem that could cause problems for us. It's precisely in that time that freedom of speech and the right to dissent and the right to express alternative views becomes more important, not less important.
Yes.
And what happened with the outbreak of COVID in March 2020 is that the opposite position was taken by governments across the world. And what they essentially said was, this is a serious virus. It's a modern day plague. We can't afford any form of dissent. We can't afford any form of questioning or any deviance from the lockdown narrative, and therefore we will punish it severely as and when it arises. That was entirely the wrong approach, because if you're going to lock down a whole society, in the UK, we were put under house arrest. We were allowed to leave our homes once a day. A hotline was set up by the cops so that you could report your neighbours if they left their house more than once a day. It was a completely surreal situation where we had the utter decimation of civil liberty in a way that had not happened ever before in the history of our country. And yet we were told, this is not the time to raise questions. This is not the time for debate. Debate is a luxury that we can't afford until we go back to normal. That is utterly wrong. It's precisely when there is an issue facing our society, a real confronting problem, that we need to have as free a discussion as possible in order that we might have made the right decision in March 2020, in my view, which is that rather than locking down, we should have had a Swedish-style scenario where people were given advice, you might not want to go here, you might not want to go there, but we're going to leave schools open, we're going to let you make your own decisions. Trusting people to make their own decisions, galvanizing people to come together as a community in order to help those who might be affected by COVID, that would have been a far better alternative to this brutish locking down of the entire of society so that people's freedom was completely and utterly crushed. But it's a good example of how when you sideline debate, when you restrict freedom of speech and freedom of dissent, you end up with really tyrannical situations. Puberty blockers, the net zero hysteria, the COVID lockdowns, all of those in some ways are a product of crushing dissent, crushing freedom of speech, restricting people's right to put their hand in the air and say, hold on, is this the right thing to do? So freedom of speech, I think, is essential to all of these questions and the right of our society to do the right thing rather than making these terrible mistakes.
Without a doubt. And that was one of the most terrifying things about the Twitter files, was finding out that our own government was involved in limiting the freedom of speech of experts, of people from Stanford and Harvard who were dissenting about the way things were handled during the pandemic. That you're literally deciding that some of the smartest people on earth shouldn't be allowed to talk because they don't fit this narrative that we all need to follow in order to survive. I'm hoping that most people woke the fuck up after that. And even if you went along with it in the beginning and you haven't apologized or you haven't consented to the fact that you were incorrect, even if you haven't just accepted it entirely, there's a part of you that knows the world got fucked over. There's a part of you that knows. So when some more nonsense comes around, maybe hold the line a little better this time.
Yeah.
And maybe next time when you're forced to adhere to very specific rules that are designed to save us from whatever thing that they have going on, whether like starvation. We have to give all the farms over to the government because we can't allow people to decide how much food gets made and how much. Yeah, then you have North Korea.
Yeah.
Then it's a slippery fucking slope, kids.
But it's interesting to hear you say that, Joe, because one thing I've realized with COVID-19 is that there's this real culture of amnesia has set in. I was thinking about this recently. I was thinking when I hang out with friends and family members and have a drink or whatever. I was thinking, it's really weird. No one ever talks about lockdown.